A jazz pianist handed Elvis a piece of music on live television and said, "Prove you're a real musician." Elvis didn't say a word. He sat down at the piano. It's 1968. NBC Studios, Burbank, California. The lights are hot. The cameras are rolling. Elvis Presley is about to film what would become one of the most important television specials in the history of American music. His career is on the line. He hasn't had a real hit in years. Hollywood has chewed him up and spit him out. The Colonel has him doing movies that even Elvis himself can't stand to watch. But none of that matters right now. Because right now, in this very studio, something is happening that nobody planned for. Something that wasn't in the script, wasn't on the call sheet, wasn't approved by anyone. A jazz pianist named Raymond Kellogg has just walked up to Elvis during a break between takes, placed a sheet of handwritten music on the piano and said, loud enough for the entire production crew to hear, "They say you're the king, so play this, prove it." 40 people in that studio froze. The director stopped mid-sentence. The sound engineers looked up from their boards. Elvis's own musicians, guys who had played with him for years, felt their blood go cold. Because this wasn't a friendly request. This was a public challenge. On a set where everything was already tense, where Elvis was already fighting to prove he still mattered, a classically trained jazz musician had just drawn a line in the sand and dared the king of rock and roll to cross it. What happened in the next 4 minutes changed everything, and I mean everything. If you're new here and you love untold stories about music legends, the kind of stories that never made it into the official biographies, hit that subscribe button right now. Because this channel is where those stories finally get told. Now let me take you back to the beginning. Because to understand what happened in that NBC studio, you need to understand who Raymond Kellogg was, why he despised Elvis Presley, and what Elvis had been secretly carrying with him since he was 11 years old. Raymond Kellogg wasn't some random musician looking for attention. The man was a legitimate force in the jazz world. He'd studied at the Oberlin Conservatory of Music in Ohio, one of the most prestigious music programs in the country. He'd toured with Dizzy Gillespie's band in the early 1950s. He'd recorded 3 solo albums that, while they never hit the pop charts, were considered essential listening among serious jazz musicians. By 1968, Kellogg was working as a session musician and music arranger in Los Angeles. He played on recordings for Capitol Records, did arrangements for television variety shows, and taught advanced jazz theory to private students who paid him handsomely for the privilege. He was brilliant, he was disciplined, and he absolutely could not stand Elvis Presley. To Kellogg, Elvis represented the theft of black music repackaged in a white body for mass consumption. But beyond the cultural politics, which were complicated and real and deserving of their own conversation, Kellogg had a specific, almost surgical contempt for what he considered Elvis's lack of musicianship. He'd said it in interviews, he'd said it at dinner parties, he'd said it to anyone who would listen. Elvis Presley cannot play. He bangs on a guitar like a child. He sits at a piano like a man pretending to drive a parked car. He is a performer, not a musician. There is a difference, and the American public is too starstruck to see it. That's an actual quote from a 1966 interview Kellogg gave to a small jazz magazine out of Chicago. He meant every word. So when Kellogg found himself hired as part of the extended musical crew for the NBC special, brought on to help with arrangements and fill in on certain ensemble pieces, he saw an opportunity. Not to collaborate, not to learn, to expose. The piece of music he placed on that piano wasn't randomly chosen. It was a jazz composition he'd written himself. A piece called Conversation in 5, built on an unusual 5/4 signature with chord voicings that required independent hand movement, complex harmonic understanding, and the ability to shift between 3 different key centers within 16 bars. It was the kind of piece that made advanced music students sweat. The kind of piece that separated people who could play from people who could truly play. And Kellogg had brought it to that studio fully expecting Elvis to stare at it blankly, laugh nervously, and confirm everything Kellogg had been saying for over a decade. He was so certain of the outcome that he'd actually told 2 other musicians on set to watch closely. "You're about to see the Emperor without his clothes," he whispered to a trumpet player named Dale Owens. Dale remembered that line for the rest of his life. Now here's where the story takes a turn that nobody saw coming. Not Kellogg, not the production crew, not even most of Elvis's inner circle. Because Elvis Presley had a secret, Not a scandalous secret, not something dark or controversial. A musical secret. One he'd been carrying quietly since childhood, one he'd never felt the need to broadcast, one that was about to become the most important card he'd ever played. Let me take you to Tupelo, Mississippi, 1948. Elvis Aaron Presley is 13 years old, skinny, shy, the kind of kid who gets overlooked in every room he walks into. His family has nothing. And I don't mean they're modest. I mean they have genuinely nothing. Vernon Presley, his father, bounces between odd jobs. Gladys, his mother, works in a garment factory. They live in a house that barely qualifies as a house. But Gladys Presley loved music. Gospel music, mostly, but she had an appreciation for all of it. And she knew her boy had something. She'd seen it since he was small, the way he listened to music differently than other children, the way his whole body seemed to absorb sound like a sponge absorbs water. There was a woman in their community named Dorothea Price. Miss Dorothea, everyone called her. She was in her late 60s, a retired music teacher who had spent 22 years teaching piano and music theory at a private academy in Nashville before health problems forced her to move back south to live with her sister. Miss Dorothea was the real deal. She trained under a student of Nadia Boulanger, the legendary French music pedagogue who taught some of the greatest composers of the 20th century. She understood music at a level that most people in Tupelo couldn't even comprehend. And she was, by all accounts, a demanding and occasionally terrifying teacher. Gladys Presley approached Miss Dorothea at church one Sunday and asked if she'd consider giving Elvis piano lessons. She was honest about their financial situation. She couldn't pay, not regularly anyway. Maybe some eggs from their chickens, maybe some help around the house, but actual money was out of the question. Miss Dorothea agreed. Not out of charity exactly, but because she'd heard Elvis sing at a church social and something about his voice caught her attention. Not the power of it, he was 13, his voice was still forming, but the phrasing, the instinct, the way he bent notes without being taught to bend them. That told her something about his ear, about his innate understanding of pitch and rhythm. For the next 3.5 years, Elvis went to Miss Dorothea's house twice a week, Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, and she did not go easy on him. She taught him scales, major, minor, harmonic minor, melodic minor. She taught him arpeggios across 4 octaves. She taught him chord theory, starting with basic triads and working up through 7th chords, 9th chords, diminished and augmented voicings. She made him study Bach inventions, Mozart sonatas, and Chopin etudes. But here's the thing that made Miss Dorothea different from most classical teachers of her era. She didn't stop at classical music. She believed, and this was unusual for a woman of her background and generation, that jazz was the highest form of American musical expression. She taught Elvis jazz harmony, bebop chord substitutions, tritone substitutions, voice leading, the kind of theory that jazz musicians spent years in conservatories learning. Elvis absorbed it like he'd been starving for it. Miss Dorothea later told her sister that Elvis was the most naturally gifted student she'd ever taught. Not the most disciplined, mind you. He could be lazy, he could be distracted, but when he focused, when something clicked, his progress was almost frightening. By the time the Presley family moved to Memphis in 1948, Elvis had 3.5 years of serious musical training under his belt. Not performance training, not how to work a crowd or sell a song. Foundational training. The kind that lives in your fingers, in your ears, in the deep architecture of how you understand sound. And then he picked up a guitar, discovered rhythm and blues, found his voice, and the rest is the history everyone knows. But those years with Miss Dorothea never left him. They became the invisible foundation underneath everything he did. He just never talked about it. Back to NBC Studios, Burbank, 1968. Raymond Kellogg has just placed Conversation in 5 on the piano. The challenge is hanging in the air. The studio has gone quiet in that uncomfortable way rooms go quiet when everyone senses something is about to go sideways. Elvis looks down at the music. His face shows nothing. Years of performing, years of dealing with Colonel Parker, years of navigating a world that constantly underestimated him, those years taught him how to keep his expression perfectly neutral when his mind was racing. The director of the special, a man named Steve Binder, later recalled watching from across the studio. "I could tell something was happening," Binder said in a 1990 interview. "I didn't know what it was. Nobody did, but I had the sense to tell my camera operators to keep rolling." Elvis studied the notation. 16 bars, 5 4 time, 3 key changes. Jazz voicings that required stretches most hands couldn't make comfortably. Independent counterpoint between the left and right hand. A syncopated rhythmic pattern in the bass that had to lock in with a completely different rhythm in the treble. He recognized what it was, not the specific piece, he'd never seen it before, but the language, the harmonic language. Miss Dorothea had taught him this language when he was 13 years old, and he'd never stopped speaking it, even if he'd stopped speaking it publicly. "You wrote this?" Elvis asked. His voice was calm, conversational, the way you'd ask someone about the weather. "I did," Kellogg said. There was triumph in his voice already. He thought Elvis was stalling. "It's good," Elvis said, and then he sat down at the piano. Now, according to Dale Owens, the trumpet player Kellogg had tipped off. What happened next lasted about 3.5 minutes, but it felt like it existed outside of time entirely. Elvis placed his hands on the keys. He didn't rush. He took a breath, and then he began to play. The first 4 bars came out clean and precise. The 5/4 signature, which trips up musicians who aren't comfortable with odd meters, didn't seem to bother him at all. His left hand locked into the syncopated bass pattern while his right hand floated above it, finding the jazz voicings with an ease that made Kellogg's jaw physically drop. That's not an exaggeration. Dale Owens was watching Kellogg's face. He said the man's mouth literally fell open by the second measure. By bar 8, Elvis was doing something that went beyond reading the notes on the page. He was interpreting them, adding subtle dynamic variations, leaning into certain dissonances, pulling back on resolutions to create tension. These weren't things written in the notation. These were choices, musical choices that required understanding not just what the notes were, but what they wanted to be. At bar 12, he did something that almost defies belief. He departed from Kellogg's written composition entirely and improvised a 4-bar variation that maintained the harmonic structure but introduced new melodic material. Jazz improvisation. Real, spontaneous, theoretically sophisticated jazz improvisation. On a piece of music he'd been looking at for less than 2 minutes. The studio was dead silent except for the piano. Someone later said you could hear the air conditioning humming. That's how quiet it was. 40 people holding their breath while Elvis Presley did something none of them knew he could do. He finished the piece. The last chord, a complex extended voicing that Kellogg had specifically designed to require a hand span and finger independence that most pianists struggled with, rang out clear and true. Elvis lifted his hands from the keys. He didn't stand up. He didn't look at Kellogg. He just sat there for a moment, his hands in his lap, like a man who just set down something heavy he'd been carrying for a very long time. The first sound that broke the silence was someone clapping. It was Steve Binder, the director. He started clapping from behind the camera setup, and within seconds the entire studio crew joined in. Grips, lighting technicians, sound engineers, makeup artists, people who had been working in entertainment for decades and thought they'd seen everything. Raymond Kellogg didn't clap, not at first. He stood completely still, his face working through emotions that he clearly wasn't prepared to feel. Confusion, disbelief, and then something deeper than both, something that looked like shame. He walked toward the piano slowly. Elvis finally looked up at him. "Where did you learn to do that?" Kellogg asked. His voice was quiet now, stripped of all the arrogance that had been there 5 minutes ago. Elvis told him. He told him about Miss Dorothea, about Tupelo, about Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, about Bach inventions and jazz harmony and a retired Nashville music teacher who saw something in a shy kid and decided to nurture it for free. Kellogg listened without interrupting. When Elvis finished, Kellogg pulled up a chair and sat down next to the piano, and the two men talked about music for 45 minutes. The production schedule fell apart. Nobody cared. Steve Binder let it happen because he understood, perhaps better than anyone in that room, that something important was taking place. Kellogg later described that conversation as one of the most humbling experiences of his life. "I walked into that studio absolutely certain that I knew who Elvis Presley was," he said in a 1984 interview. "I was wrong. I wasn't just a little wrong. I was fundamentally, completely, embarrassingly wrong. The man understood music at a level I hadn't even considered possible for someone in his world. And my arrogance prevented me from seeing it until he literally sat down and showed me." But here's the part of the story that really gets me. After their conversation, Elvis asked Kellogg not to tell anyone what had happened. Think about that. Elvis had just demolished every criticism anyone had ever leveled at his musicianship. He had proof, witnessed by 40 people, that he was far more than a pretty face with a good voice, and he didn't want anyone to know. Kellogg was baffled. "Why would you want to keep this quiet?" he asked. And Elvis, according to Kellogg's account, said something that has stuck with me ever since I first read it. He said, "Because Miss Dorothea didn't teach me piano so I could win arguments. She taught me so I could understand music, and I do understand it. I don't need anyone else to know that for it to be true." That's the kind of quiet confidence that only comes from genuine knowledge, from a foundation so solid that it doesn't need external validation. Elvis didn't need Raymond Kellogg's approval. He didn't need the world to know he could play jazz piano. He knew that was enough. Kellogg respected Elvis's wish for a while. He didn't go public with the story immediately. But over the years, he told close friends, fellow musicians, students. The story leaked out slowly, the way all great stories eventually do, through whispered retellings and late-night conversations in jazz clubs and backstage at concerts. The encounter changed Raymond Kellogg profoundly. He softened, not just toward Elvis, but toward music itself. He started listening differently, started hearing things in pop and rock and country that he'd been deliberately ignoring for years. In 1971, he wrote an essay for Downbeat magazine called "The Walls We Build Between Notes," arguing that the rigid separation between musical genres was damaging to musicians and to music itself. He cited his encounter with Elvis without naming him directly, referring to him as a musician whose public image bore no resemblance to his private abilities. Jazz musicians who knew the backstory recognized exactly who he was talking about. The essay became one of the most discussed pieces Downbeat published that decade. Miss Dorothea Price passed away in 1963, 5 years before the confrontation at NBC Studios. She never knew the full scope of what her student had become. She never saw him on television, never heard him perform in Las Vegas, never witnessed the cultural earthquake that Elvis Presley set off across the world. But her nephew, a man named William Price who still lived in Tupelo, told a local reporter in 1975 that his aunt had kept a scrapbook of Elvis clippings until the day she died. Every newspaper article, every magazine cover, every mention she could find. She never told anyone outside the family about the lessons. She considered it a private matter between a teacher and a student. On the last page of the scrapbook, she had written a single sentence in her careful, precise handwriting. It said, "He listened. That was always enough." Elvis himself rarely spoke about his classical and jazz training in interviews. When he did, it was usually in passing, a brief mention of learning piano as a child, nothing that would make headlines. He seemed content to let the music speak for itself, to let people hear what they wanted to hear and leave the rest hidden. But those who played with him knew. His session musicians, his band members, the arrangers who worked on his recordings, they all knew that Elvis understood music at a level that his public image didn't reflect. They heard it in the way he communicated with musicians, using technical language that surprised people who expected him to speak in vague, emotional terms. They saw it in the way he'd occasionally sit at a piano during a recording session and suggest a chord substitution that made everyone in the room stop and think. Larry Muhobrak, who played piano for Elvis in the late 1960s, once said, "People don't understand. Elvis could have sat in with any jazz combo in America and held his own. He chose not to because that wasn't what moved him. He loved rock and roll. He loved gospel. He loved connecting with an audience in a way that jazz clubs don't really allow. But the knowledge was there, always." I think the reason this story matters, the reason it stays with me, isn't really about piano technique or jazz harmony or whether Elvis could sight-read a difficult piece of music. It's about the assumptions we make about people. Raymond Kellogg walked into that studio with his mind already made up. He'd built an entire narrative about who Elvis Presley was, what he could do, what he understood, and what he couldn't possibly know. He'd constructed that narrative from the outside, from album covers and television appearances and newspaper headlines. He never once considered that there might be depth he couldn't see. And he's not unusual. We all do this. We look at people and we think we understand them based on the parts of themselves they show the world. We put them in categories. We decide what they're capable of. We write our own chord progressions and hand them over, expecting failure, because confirming our assumptions feels better than having them destroyed. Elvis could have spent his entire career correcting people like Kellogg. He could have given interviews about his training, performed classical pieces at concerts, released a jazz album. He had the ability. He had the knowledge. He chose not to because proving himself to skeptics wasn't why he made music. He made music because a retired piano teacher in Tupelo, Mississippi taught him that sound could become feeling, that notes on a page could become something alive, and that the highest purpose of music wasn't to impress people. It was to move them. Miss Dorothea understood that. She taught it to a boy who was listening, and he carried it with him through every recording session, every concert, every moment on stage for the rest of his life. The foundation she built was invisible to the world, but it held up everything the world could see. So let me ask you something. Is there a teacher in your life who gave you something you've never properly acknowledged? Someone who invested in you when they didn't have to? Someone whose lessons are still showing up in your work, your thinking, your life, even if the world doesn't know about it? Drop their name in the comments. Tell me about them. Not for clicks, not for engagement metrics, but because those people deserve to be remembered. The Miss Dorotheas of the world, the ones who taught for love, who saw potential in kids who couldn't afford 50 cents, who built invisible foundations that held up extraordinary lives. They deserve their names spoken out loud. And if this story hit you somewhere unexpected, share it with someone who needs to hear it. Someone who's been hiding parts of themselves because they don't think the world is ready. Someone who's been told they're not a real musician, not a real artist, not a real anything, by people who never bothered to look past the surface. The world is full of people carrying hidden depths. Sometimes all it takes is one moment, one challenge, one chance to sit down at the piano and play for the truth to come out. Subscribe if you want more stories like this. Stories about the moments that reveal who these legends really were when the cameras weren't supposed to be rolling. Turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one. Because these stories aren't really about famous people. They're about the quiet, invisible forces that made them who they were. And those forces, those teachers, those lessons, those Tuesday afternoons and Saturday mornings, they matter more than any spotlight ever could. I'll see you in the next one.